bit about that with us.
Okay. Well, if you notice, most people who are having problems with their lives, they seek, solutions and answers to these problems through everything external to them.
People like me even sometimes.
Yeah,
Too
and
much.
myself included. I've done this and I still do it. But sometimes we can find ourselves really feeling unfulfilled by these answers that we're receiving from outside of us. Because no one else really knows, what's going on in your emotions, what's going on in your life, including your entire past, what you've been through as a child, and all of these things. So if you go to, say, a therapist, and you want to talk about your problems in order to get insight, it can be helpful to get it off your chest maybe, but as far as finding answers, you might begin to see that you really have the answers, the best answers for yourself are inside you through your higher self. And so just learning to bring that through, whether you do it out loud, through speaking, through writing, or through just meditation and allowing yourself to receive the thoughts, these answers through the form of thought, whatever works for you, you'll realize if you tune into yourself, you know the answers. You have the answers for your own problems inside.
So self-awareness is a huge vehicle for getting to the answers from what I'm gathering. And actually, tell us a little bit about your book being geared around this, because if I'm not mistaken, there are aspects about the book that really talk and direct the messages around patterns and behaviors and addictions. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it really took a lot of courage for me to expose some of these deeply personal underlying dynamics in my own life. And I was a little bit embarrassed to publish this book because the messages are so powerful, and I myself have not yet mastered living up to what they're teaching. But that's kind of the whole point, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To share our vulnerabilities instead of putting on this image to the world, of our ego, and we have these fragile egos, and not wanting to admit, even to ourselves, these painful truths that we have inside of us.
You're so right about that. I have to say that, when I was reading the book, it rung a lot of truth. I know even in my own walk, that when we start looking at ourselves and recognize that, hey, I'm not the only one that may have this issue. There's somebody else out there, and there's no such a thing as a, superior guru state that you just stop learning and stop evolving and stop growing.
Right. And that stopped me for so long from sharing these messages because I felt before I could share them, I needed to be this perfect living example of everything they teach.
That's what we have been taught pretty much. Yeah.
But I am the first to admit I'm not there. And actually last year I went to a Celebrate Your Life conference in Phoenix. And one of the guest speakers on the very last day was Neil Donald Walsh. And someone in the audience had asked him, he is the author of the Conversations with God series.
Yes, I'm familiar.
And somebody had asked him, what makes him human? What makes him like the rest of us? And what is the area in his life where he feels vulnerable?
Interesting.
Yeah. And he said, I was embarrassed to publish my books at first because my life is nothing like what my books teach, and I have not mastered these things.
Wow.
I feel embarrassed. And I thought, wow, that's exactly how I've been feeling.
Wow.
And yet he published them anyway, and his books went on to touch so many lives.
Absolutely. That is a huge monumental point you're making in that example and in your own experience through this, because so many people, myself included, was of the school of thought and is of the school of thought that we need to be, got it going on perfect before we can tell somebody else. I've always had the mindset that, somebody who's made enough mistakes might be the one that might help you not, make that mistake or tell you what not to do, or offer some guidance in some way.
And we also, you've probably heard it said, we teach what we most need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that aspect as well. There's the message and there's the messenger.
Absolutely.
And these messages, the section of my book called the messages in the center of the book, those are not my writings. Those are the messages that have been given to me, that have come through me, and are an example of what I believe anyone who wants to can receive for themselves.
Well, that was leading to the next question I wanted to ask you, because as you mentioned earlier, so many people, they get the heebie-jeebies when you use certain words like channeling.
Yeah.
And, it's associated with, in a lot of people's minds, something evil and something bad. And I've said for many years that, people who have created great works of art, music, that was a form of channeling, whether people want to accept that or not. And many of them have said so. That they got into this space and the information just came through, or the rhythms and the notes and the tunes just came through them, and they were just the vehicle to play them.
Exactly.
And so this is another example. So share with us a little bit of how you came comfortable with that aspect of yourself, because I think a lot of people perhaps maybe share your interpretation of what that means for you channeling, and then how you became comfortable with it. Because I still feel there are tons of people who may really benefit from this, considering your conservative background.
Well, I, was definitely one of those people who had the EBGBs, as you say, about the word channeling or psychic or anything of that sort. And so my recommendation is to not label it, I mean, I tried to explain that in my introduction, that I used the word channeling only because that's the word that was given to me within that very first, it was part 2 of my very first message in the book. And yet I go on to say that, it may not fit the definition for channeling for some people. Like, for example, Ramtha may not agree that what I'm doing is channeling.
And that is an entity, I believe, that was channeled through a woman back in the 80s, Jay-Z Knight, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and she's still doing that, and she completely leaves her body. She says that she's thrown out of her body. That is not my experience of channeling for me. But I just think that there's all different ways to receive messages, and if we don't put the word channeling on it, then a lot of people could possibly become comfortable. They could say, I am just listening to God. I am listening to my highest guidance. I am receiving messages of love. It doesn't have to be anything so mystical.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that, because at the end of the day, the difference will be felt in the sense that it is a positive, inspirational, uplifting, motivating type of experience. And that is definitely very descriptive of love.
Right. And going back to what you had asked me before, am I putting my thoughts into it? There's been a couple times where I've done a question and answer session. So for the question part, of course, that was me. That was my thought in a question. But for the answer part, I joke that I had to get out of my mind.
Right.
And if I'm thinking, I am not channeling.